Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. We're kicking off now live number 3. And today on Earth Day, and as I was saying earlier today on LinkedIn, maybe radical idea, kicking off an Earth year, we are going to be talking about decarbonization. I'm really excited to be talking about this because there's no more important discussion to have on this critical day, a day when our planet is definitely not healthy. It's not in its best state. And I have the great honor to be joined by our one and only Bobby, who is the decarbonization lead of Plan A. As you might know, we have been putting since day one in the company a big emphasis on science. This has been incredibly important to us in order to allow us to make our work credible, to make sure that the impact that we have for our clients is also visible and tangible. And also, it has been there to make sure that we are with a really clear agenda for how we act on our mission and how we involve others to be part of that. So, without further ado, I would love to invite Bobby to join me on stage. Hi, Bobby.
Hi, Lubomila.
Really good to see you as usual. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm great. The weather is not so good in Berlin, but otherwise great. It's still cloudy. Talking about weather and
Amazing. Well, really happy to be here with you. And I am super excited to be able to share with people not only about Plan A's approach to decarbonization, but also about your work, about your journey into the topic. I think you have had a phenomenal act before Plan A even. And I think it would be fantastic if we can start by you sharing a bit more about what you've been doing and why you've been focusing on decarbonization since the beginning of your career.
yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Um, as as everyone knows now, I guess I'm the decarbonization lead at Plan A. But prior to joining Plan A, I did my PhD and postdoc at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, PIC, as we call it. PIC is basically founded in the same year as we had the Rio conference. Basically, the whole idea was to focus on system dynamics or nonlinear dynamics, to put it that way. And since then, PIC has been focusing quite a lot on issues concerning climate change mitigation and adaptation. I did my PhD on global cities and how we can mitigate cities. And later I worked as a postdoc where I was giving technical and scientific advisory to the Ministry of Urban Development and Ministry of Environment and Forests in India, and also to the German government. PIC, for those who don't know, is one of the best renowned research institutes on climate change research, and it is consistently ranked among the top 5. And the main contribution of PIC to the world is the research articles that the institute produces, and which were also featured in the last and previous IPCC reports. Prior to joining PIC, I worked as an advisor at the German International Cooperation, GIZ as we call it, where I was supporting large-scale urban infrastructure projects and making sure that they are climate-proofed and do not emit so much, so to say.
Amazing journey. Thank you so much for sharing the details about this with us. What has been your feeling over the last few years in terms of the climate movement? You've seen it from the academia side. You now are in the entrepreneurial business side. We're empowering hundreds of businesses to reduce their emissions. Are we in a positive mood? Are we in a negative one? How are you feeling?
I think more than beyond positive and negative, I'm in a very optimistic mood, I would say. I think what I see, listen over the last 2 years, especially, has been phenomenal. Not in terms of what we see in terms of The impacts of climate change, the forest fires, etc., it has also been exacerbated over the period of time, but more in terms of the movement, the Fridays for Future movement, for example, and the scientists for future, the doctors for future. There, when I see people coming out on the streets and actually giving a clear voice that they care for the environment, they are willing to even compromise a bit of their lifestyle to have a better climate for all, really gives me a lot of optimism and positive vibes.
This is really great, and I definitely can just second that. We've never seen so much activity. Planning now has existed for more than 5 years, and we have been there at times when there was very little understanding of what really Scope 1, 2, 3 was, and what really corporate action on climate meant. So this definitely gives us the confidence that we're headed in the right direction. One maybe fundamental understanding that is needed to set the scene for this discussion would be just to get your take on the role of decarbonization. I know that this is the topic of the whole event that we have today, but it would be great if you can just share, why do we need to reduce emissions? Why is this actually on top of the agenda of corporates?
Right. So, just to add to the previous question, I think it's worthwhile to also mention the optimism that I see also since I joined Plan A with the existing clients that we have and the prospects as well. There is a tremendous momentum in the corporate world right now to decarbonize. And the reason for it is very clear, that they face intrinsic and extrinsic pressures on top of their own will to be a climate pioneer, so to say. So, to come back to the question you just asked, I think what we need to do is to take a time capsule and go back in time. Today, greenhouse gases are bad, but greenhouse gases, the name itself says that they be possible on Earth. Life on Earth was possible because of the so-called greenhouse gases. What they do, they trap a certain amount of heat, solar radiation that we get from the sun, instead of reflecting everything back to the space. And as a result of the trapped heat, because of these greenhouse gases, we have life possible on Earth, because that made sure that we have the water cycles, the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, all the living creatures, etc., etc. Now, if we take the time capsule and zoom a bit forward, how things have evolved post-industrial revolution, human activities and human-induced consumption of so-called fossil fuels has increased their concentration in our atmosphere over a period of time. As we get more and more greenhouse gases trapped in our atmosphere, because Earth has gravity and these gases can't simply just escape, that's the atmosphere that we are talking about. As we have more and more gases which get trapped in our atmosphere, our Earth as a global phenomena is getting more and more hot. And this is what we call runaway global warming. And now we are not stopping, we are even post-industrial revolution, even further, more and more fossil fuels are being consumed, and more heat is getting trapped in the Earth's atmosphere. That's global warming. Now, climate change is how global warming manifests itself in space and time. And it is the effect of warming planet is not the same across all the places on the globe, and it changes depending on the local conditions, and this impact is what we call as climate change. So why decarbonization is important is because if we do not reduce the human induced climate change, we are at the risk of transgressing the planetary boundaries and making sure that we are making life more and more difficult to live on Earth. So this comes from a general innate human tendency that we don't want to live Earth the way we know it. And that's why this geological epoch is called Anthropocene, because nowhere in the entire history of Earth had one single species dominated it so much as we as humans do today.
Thank you so much for this explanation, as always, clear and elaborate. When we talk about decarbonization, you really clearly explained why it matters to think about the big picture, the whole concept is something that we all have responsibility for, given clearly we're the species that has been there to create the issue at the first place. But it would be interesting to talk about the business side of things. Businesses have been claimed to have polluted the planet. There was a few articles that came out in the last few weeks stating the number over 70% being within the hands of 100 companies even. Where do businesses have to play a part in the whole decarbonization agenda?
Right. So I think we are all familiar with the so-called Paris Agreement, where all the global leaders came together, realized, and said that yes, it is human-induced climate change that we are seeing. It's not another geological or natural approach that we are seeing. And the general agreement back in the Paris is to actually limit global warming by 2 degrees until end of the century, and even further. Now, there is this beautiful graph that Climate Action Tracker and NGO keeps tracking on a regular basis. And if you look at this graph, we see that the current pledges that we have are not enough to actually ensure that we are on track of 1.5 or 2 degree approach. Now, this can be scaled all the way from the nation states to the regions to the cities, and this is where we have businesses. Businesses, as I said before, I am very optimistic with what seeing really disheartens everyone, but it's never late to start. We can't go back and change the past, but we can always start a new beginning today. And businesses here play a very crucial role for two aspects. One, because of understanding their impact on the planet directly or indirectly. And two, they realize that there is also even a market potential that they can capture as businesses. And we all know that the fundamental idea is to look at growth, to look at return in investments, which is not fundamentally bad. The only issue comes and highly correlated with the impact in terms of climate, in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions they do. The whole idea of climate action is, in my opinion, Andrea Catalina wrote Decarbonization Degrowth. I would say not necessarily, because there is a possibility to reduce our impact on the atmosphere while actually getting the return in investments as well. Sure, it is a long run goal. You don't see the return in investments as fast as you see otherwise, but this is a long run which is both good, and there is enough scientific evidence which says that if for those companies which invest heavily on decarbonizing are the ones which also on a long run see a higher cumulative aggregated growth rate.
So, from what you're saying, I'm understanding that if you decarbonize, you are going to, in the longer term, have a higher market value. Um, let's make it a bit more maybe contemporary. What about offsetting? Because there's been a lot of discussion about offsetting. Many companies say decarbonization is difficult. We don't have the money. We don't have the investments to make. Well, then we compensate. But how do you compare these two? And can you speak about the costs associated to them?
Right. So I think McKinsey is one of the, no, not think, I'm sure that McKinsey is one of the companies that pioneered the so-called cost abatement curves. So basically, when we talk about cost abatement curves, we do not talk about offsets. What we talk about is the existing technological options that we have to reduce our emissions and the cost. Of course, costs change over time depending on the demand and supply, the global supply chain, etc., etc. But this for companies gives a very good idea on how much do I have to invest if I have to reach a certain degree of target? We will briefly talk about the science-based targets as we move on. But here, the idea is decarbonization is not offsetting. I keep saying this again and again that usually for companies taking corporate action, is they calculate their emissions, they meticulously go through the painful process of the corporate carbon accounting, and once they calculate their emissions, they do the corporate carbon accounting, they immediately buy offsets, and then they say we are a climate neutral company. This, in my opinion, is straight away greenwashing. And companies can reduce. Investing in decarbonization does good for the company. How? I can give, if I have time, may I give a simple example? Many companies, especially in Europe, right? When we have an office space, we say that, okay, we will go relatively with the most affordable electricity option, right? And then they say like, okay, for heating, it is as it is. We usually rent, so we don't have to do anything. So the simple switch at the office space from non-renewable to renewable electricity, actually, while coming across as a climate-friendly company, will also ensure at scale the increase in demand for renewable power, which even forces the government to invest more and more on renewable powers. And on the other hand, for heating, if we simply retrofit, in Germany, most of the emissions from buildings come from heating. The simple retrofit saves you costs for heating. This is money in your pocket. Okay, there are some capital investments that you have to do, but it saves money. Of course, it gets a bit challenging as we move on. So the simple idea of calculating emissions and investing in offsets is straight away greenwashing. Companies should reduce whatever they can before investing in high quality offsets. We can talk about this more as we have more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for this. And it was really clearly explained. So, ultimate goal, like first decarbonize and then compensate. If you're only compensating, then the quality of the offsets needs to be a certain level. Otherwise, there's a lot of chances of greenwashing. So, a question that we often get in Plan A, and you obviously are the one that answered, but I'm learning along the way together with you, has been. What are the first steps that I can take as a company? And maybe we can start first with an example of a small to medium sized company. And then we can move into the industrials and others. But what steps can a company take today or within a week that would be the first ones into decarbonization?
Right. So the first thing that companies should be doing is basically to actually have at least one person responsible for and is aware of doing the corporate carbon footprinting, the emission accounting. And this person can be the contact point for all the departments, because when you have, even in a small company, there are multiple verticals responsible for multiple activities which translate to emissions. So one idea, what the first step is to calculate the emissions. Once you know your emissions, then the second step is basically to set the so-called science-based targets. So science-based target initiative is basically an initiative by multiple organizations globally. They came forward and they developed the so-called protocol for corporates of different sizes, from small and medium enterprises to large scale industries, even industry specific. They set this standard, so to say, on how companies should set science-based targets. And then the next step is to, once you have a baseline year and a target year, and you know how much you want to reduce, this pretty much looks like how it works in companies, but the other way with the growth. When you ask a finance department, right? Except we are seeing that we are bending the curve, not increasing the curve. And the idea is, you know where you stand, you know where you want to go, and then you start searching for the options. What options do I have? What are my major activities that are responsible for my emissions. What can I change? How much should I change on a yearly basis if I were, as a company, were to be on track towards the set target for my company? Once you reduced on an annual basis and you are aligned with the so-called target, only those part of emissions which you can't reduce should be invested. And here I go, high quality carbon credits. Offsets are, I don't know. I'm not with my scientific background. I'm never a big fan of the word offsets, but it's basically one should rather call as high quality offsets. We do have principles for it. There are Oxford principles for net zero aligned carbon offsets. So high quality offsets are those which can be traced. High quality offsets are obviously expensive, much more expensive than the traditional offsets. And high quality offsets make sure that you only compensate for those emissions which you can't reduce. I
Mm-hmm.
can't stress this enough.
Yeah.
So these are the 3 points for in the corporate decarbonization journey. Calculate your emissions, set science-based targets, and then on a roadmap until 2050, focus on net zero.
Amazing. Really clear and really well understood. One thing that I definitely gathered from what you just said is that the first step is really the analysis. The first step is really understanding where you're standing. And I want to kind of use the last question you answered with a little bit of a devil's advocate kind of perspective. You said allocate one person to the topic, they're going to coordinate it amongst departments. How do you do that in a 10-person company? This is not really something that is possible. Even in a 200-person company, we see it with some of the private equities that we work with some of the larger scale ups that we work with, that this person does not exist. What should companies do in these kinds of cases?
The simple and easy way to do this, to actually at least begin, is use any of the existing tools which are free, which are online, just to get a fundamental idea of the scope of emissions. If you are a 10-person company, you really don't need to worry much. But I don't believe, I mean, you don't need to worry much about the scale of your emissions, right? But I don't believe that you will always remain a 10-person company. This is not why we build companies, right? You are aiming at a 200, 2,000 employee company. And there is a simple saying by Marcus Aurelius who said that it's easy to cross the river at the beginning. It's very simple. So the idea is, as you, if you don't cross the river in the beginning, moving on, the river becomes bigger and bigger and tougher. So the whole idea is, if you have this person who already is aware of your company's modus operandi, despite being a 10 people company, he can get all the standard operating procedures in place so that you don't need to invest time and energy later to, okay, where do I get this energy fuel consumption data from? How do I check my travel, my business travel? How are my employees commuting? Where are we getting all these emissions from, right? So this is why it is important for companies to, for immediately to check for anything which is available online. But these tools also come with a caveat, so to say, that they might not be 100% sure. And when you actually disclose these emissions, you might be questioned about the activity data you used or the emission factors you used. That's why there are professional people, let's say, who sometimes have a PhD like me, to actually have to actually help these companies to say, like, guys, this is the right way, and we only need to get it done once and correct. We don't have to worry. Let's focus on the important part. That's the decarbonization.
Amazing. This was a really fantastic way of making sure that now no one has an excuse to not do work on sustainability in any size company. My next question will be about the larger companies. So we work with really large corporates, BMW, big banks, also big scope 3 level emission entities like private equity, hedge funds, and so on. How do you think about the sustainability agenda in these kinds of organizations? What is the role of decarbonization for them, and how do you think about kicking off this process?
Right. So for larger companies, it gets a bit trickier. And also even for smaller companies as they grow. Because I will start with the smaller companies a bit and then move their journey as they become big. Let's say you are a smaller company of 10 people, and then you are scaling at you're seeing a hyper growth. You're doing the best thing you can do in the market. You're seeing hyper growth. In the next 2 years, you increase 20-fold and you have 200 employees. Now, the science-based target says that you have to reduce absolutely by at least 42% until 2030. Now, this is the question I'm constantly asked, especially from small and medium-sized enterprises. We are a small company, we are a small and medium enterprise, and you are telling that we have to reduce by 42% absolute reduction. So in the baseline, you calculate your emissions with 10 employees, you calculate your emissions, and then you say if there are, let's say, 100 tons of CO2 equivalent, your target emissions in the year 2030 should be 42% less. So it's 58 and 58 tons of CO2e, and you're seeing a hyperscale. So what we are seeing is two graphs, one graph with the number of employees and the growth and the emissions above, and another one which wants to bend the curve in this direction. Now, the idea here again is the same, just like the employee thing. When you have a standard sustainable procurement policy in place, when you have an employee commute policy, when you give incentives for your employees who work from home to switch to renewable electricity, when you make sure that your business travel never allows short haul flights, these are all the examples that you can establish today as you grow, so that you never see these emissions in the first place. And as I said, these standard operating procedures having these, so in some sense, you have to align your corporate plan, growth plan with your climate plan. The sooner you do it, the easier it will become for you. And as I said before, those we cannot reduce should be invested later on high quality offsets. For larger companies, it's a difficult story and a different story altogether. There is both a challenge and an opportunity. The opportunity is there, since they are already big, they can invest high. You look at Microsoft, Google, they're all investing on carbon capture and sequestration, which is the most expensive way of doing it. Is it good? Is it right? Are they taking the right actions they should already take? Probably some yes, probably some no. But that's their opportunity, because they can capture because they are already big, they can capture and do decarbonization at scale. Now, the challenge is for these companies, they have invested for long in multiple streams and multiple products. So at large, it looks super overwhelming. But as we go into the nitty gritty of individual departments or products and start seeing where do the emissions for this product come from, then it becomes easy. Large companies like BMW, they are already aware of it. If I remember correctly, we might hopefully not see any internal combustion engine by after 2025. The new ones, the existing, what we do with the existing ones and where do we get the minerals for the electric vehicles, that's a different story altogether. But if you look at the life cycle emissions of a typical car, most of the emissions comes from while the car being on the road, and that's from fossil fuels.
Just nagging a little bit further down the line, because I feel like, you're saying it's difficult and different, but what do corporates need to do in order to reduce their emissions? And I'm saying this question with the full awareness that probably for any corporate that is not awoken to the reality that they need to reduce their emissions, they're actually behind their whole industry. But what do they need to do? Practical terms, and kind of, again, step-by-step process.
So for bigger corporates, the first step is to look at your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So this varies from companies to company. For a typical IT company, most of the emissions would be from your scope 3, especially purchase goods and services and the life cycle in the upstream and downstream of your products. But for manufacturing heavy companies, you have higher emissions from your scope 1 and scope 2. That's electricity, heating, and purchased heat, etc., etc. Now, this is where the cost abatement curves will come into place. You say, like, okay, I have, I don't know, a manufacturing plant, a car manufacturing plant, let's say, and it runs on coal-fired power plant. It's cheap. I get subsidy because I'm a huge company. But now, if I were to shift, I have to see how much I have to pay as a premium to actually shift and reduce my electricity emissions. But at the same time, since this is the opportunity part I was saying, I can focus on generating that electricity if I have enough space and other criteria by myself. Then you save over a period of time money because your return on investments will be your own electricity generating power plant. So the first step is for bigger corporates is to basically see your scope, where do most of your emissions come from? Scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. For production heavy, it's scope 1 and scope 2. For more industry, for more service sector aligned, like venture capitals and banks, etc., these are predominantly in your scope 3. For banks and investments, it's basically category 15 on investments, and there are nice methodologies on how you can calculate and even decarbonize your emissions. So once you have scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, you evaluate different options and develop the so-called decarbonization pathways. I stand here, I want to go there. These are the technologies which will take me there. These are the behavioral shifts which will take me there. And these are the emissions which are inevitable. And this is what I will invest in: high quality carbon credits.
Okay, thank you so much for this. I found a lot of questions about offsetting in the chat. I think you start some thinking with your comment about low quality, high quality offsets. Can you just explain what this is? And then we'll go back to the corporates again.
Right. So low quality offsets are basically those companies which come to you and say, like, yeah, you just pay us €5 per ton, and we get you a tag on how we will offset, and you don't have to worry. There are some companies who even certify that. Now, the low quality offsets, there are two ways of looking at it: a qualitative way and a quantitative way. A qualitative way of looking at it is you really want to know where this money is going. And in most of the cases, we don't know. And that's why, from a qualitative point of view, you, even as a company which invested in these low quality offsets, do not know your real impact. If the typical offsets, when they come with growing trees, let's say, we have finite amount of space on Earth is huge, sure, but we have finite amount of space on Earth. And then if you look at Amazon, for example, a vast share of deforestation that happened in Amazon region, in the Amazon rainforest, is predominantly because of land use change. And the land use change because there was a huge demand for meat industry, which need a fodder, and the rainforest was cut to use as a fodder to produce fodder for the poultry and the livestock which we consume here in Europe. Now, there are different dynamics that happen in the land use change, right? It's the same with the palm oil case few years ago, which also erased few rainforests in Asia. That's why think twice before investing on the low quality offsets. A, you have to make sure that you really see the impact, and B, you have to see the bigger picture on whether it is even possible. I'm sorry, but I will take one of your comments, Lou. You don't eat the fruit the day you sow the seed. These trees don't, the plantation, it takes time to sequester carbon, to be ripe enough to sequester enough carbon from the atmosphere. And you have to also look at the life cycle. Now, what are high quality offsets? High quality offsets are predominantly focusing on technologies that we have at scale today, which really helps in abating the emissions that would otherwise go into the atmosphere, or directly capturing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it for a longer period of time. It sounds a bit like science fiction, but Climworks, for example, is doing an amazing job in this regard, but it's very expensive. We don't have this at scale. Imagine our atmosphere is predominantly nitrogen, it's not even oxygen. We don't breathe we breathe nitrogen, but it doesn't interact because it's close to an inert gas. But the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is already so low, and you have to trace that carbon dioxide, capture it, and then store it at scale. As a technology, this is going to take time, and that's why it is currently expensive.
Okay, so high quality, low quality offsets, companies have the choice to make, individuals have the choice to make. I want to add one comment related to direct air capture. I was quite shocked by a piece of statistic that I found a few months ago, which was that the highest efficient facility that we have at the moment for direct air capture worldwide is with the equivalent of 900 cars being introduced on the road, whereas India last year introduced 1 million. So just to understand where we're standing on that, definitely believe in the technology, but long way to go until it can do the work. So we clearly need to decarbonize. There's quite a lot of questions in the chat, but I want to encourage anyone that is still from the 100 people that are online watching to add to the chat further questions. I want to kick off with one that is from someone anonymous. Thank you so much for the question. That is about Happy Earth Day, everyone. What are the major frameworks around decarbonization businesses should be aware of?
This market till date is still voluntary. So there are new regulations kicking in depending on your geographic locations. There's a new regulation in the US that came recently. We have the EU taxonomy, which which came as a part of the EU Green Deal. The idea is, at the moment, if you want to claim that you are a carbon neutral company, you need to, under EU taxonomy, show how. So that's a framework. Now, who this is valid to, who it is not valid to, is still under discussion, and the EU is also debating whether to include more. Recently, initially, it was only for those companies which are publicly listed. Now it is increasing in scope, so that all companies have to do it. Currently, nobody will punish you if you are not decarbonizing as a business. But by not taking climate action, we are doing harm only to ourselves. On a broader scale, at a planetary on a planetary scale, we know the impacts. But even for a company itself, people are aware. People want climate action. They are very conscious about what products they are buying currently. Especially, I would say here, even Europe is a bit higher than other countries, but this will soon kick in other parts of the world as well. And one thing which you should also be aware of is not just the users of your company, your clients, but it is also for your own employees. There is a recent LinkedIn, I saw in LinkedIn, there is a recent survey which says that the more than a whopping 60% of employees want to work in a company which is climate responsive. And if you want to retain the good employee you have, better start taking climate action today.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I can only add to this list also investors who are betting with their money on what is really a responsible action. The ESG related funds and assets essentially have now gone to up to 10% of total assets internationally. And or investment funds, sorry, have gone up to 10%. And that has been the fastest growth that has ever been seen in 2021. Where we essentially were not only hearing the headlines, but clearly were being moved, where responsible action was being taken. I want to move the question to, we have someone that is asking if there's going to be a recording. There is a recording of this session. I think one topic, Bobby, that you love, and this is because your PhD is actually about cities. So, how sustainable our cities are to combat climate change in the near future. I let you take this one because I know you're incredibly excited about this as a whole.
Right, and we at Plan A are also in the process of discussing with some cities in Europe and also globally to actually make sure that they take the right climate action. So yeah, keep seeing this space for more news. So our cities at the moment are responsible for roughly 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions because they also host roughly 70%, depending on how you define what cities are. You know, I live in Berlin, and Potsdam is called a different city, but if you look at how connected Berlin and Potsdam are, I would say they're both the same cities. Now, if you ask me how sustainable our cities are today to combat climate change, I don't think not all cities are equipped with the right technical, financial, and infrastructural capabilities. We are looking a bit more on when we talk about combating climate change, we are focusing more on the adaptation part and minimize risk minimization part. Uh, the reason why it is the different is we live in a world where we see rapid urbanization in continents where we already don't have any basic infrastructure in place predominantly, and they are not very well prepared to take the impacts of climate change because they are highly sensitive and vulnerable. And what we are currently doing is cities have already realized that they are both at the giving end and the receiving end of climate change. They release the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere because of all the activities that happen in the city, and on the other hand, they are also on the receiving end. At the moment, those who are contributing and those who are receiving are completely different because the global north is predominantly responsible for the emissions, and the global south is the one which is receiving it. How we can develop this is we already have certain frameworks and governance policies in place to actually enable the cities, especially in global south. I come from global south. They do not have all the technical requirements, and GIZ as a company I worked earlier is pretty much doing that. It's a very broad question, Rohan. Maybe we can take this offline. I would be very happy to talk more about this.
What I really love from what you said is that we need to think of cities as systems, and you gave the example of Berlin. What you have taught me, amongst the many things that you've taught me, is that we need to think of cities as clusters of industries, as this complex organism that requires a multitude of actions that sometimes feel like you're taking a decarbonization strategy for 5 industries, 10 industries at the same time. And if you think about it in this way, probably cities seem to have a complex job. But from what we're seeing, on the other hand, from the cities that we're speaking to, there's not only a lot of excitement, but because cities always had to work in this way to distribute projects, ideas, innovation, they have had the chance already to be able to think in these complex systems and have a better chance probably than many even companies uh, to be able to deploy such strategies if there is a lot of willingness.
Absolutely. There are many similarities between cities and companies. You know, like as you previously said, company of 10 people, cities also start with 10 people as a simple settlements, and then they grow as big cities, not big cities overnight. Very many similarities. Even GG protocol, when it developed corporate carbon footprints, they also developed it for cities, which is very similar because we can think about cities as clusters as industry, or we can also think about cities as self-repeating fractals, so to say. So you have a corporate, you see this different departments, you have a city, you have different neighborhoods. There are so many parallels one can draw. The decarbonization approach, though, remains the same. When we do it at a city, we are doing it at a scale. When we do it at a company, you have more things under your control, so to say.
Yeah. One probably interesting topic for many of the listeners here is the topic of how do you consider decarbonization as a business opportunity? So you mentioned earlier, well, we should definitely think about making the investments in advance, and then we start accumulating all the savings over time. There's even some in cases where when you set up the system in one way now, you're not even going to see some of the emissions occur. But what about the business opportunity in the sense of what businesses should think of so that they make decarbonization part of the next version of the strategy that they're developing?
Yeah, so there is a fashion brand. I don't know if I can take names, but there is a fashion brand which basically said, "Do not buy this jacket." That's their marketing strategy because they listed all the materials that went into it, the carbon footprint of this jacket, and and not surprisingly, this is the highly bought jacket. That's the whole that kind of that story explains why decarbonization is so important for your corporate branding, because you do not need to reduce all this and invest heavily on decarbonization from day one. But as long as the narrative is very clear and, most importantly, transparent, you're doing a very good job. So maybe that's a very good starting point of looking at decarbonization. This is my corporate carbon footprint. This is the activity data I use. These are the emission factors that we use. This is something that I disclose publicly. This is my target setting, as I said before. This is where I stand. This is my target year. This is how much I want to decarbonize, and these are the steps I'm going to take. There is very high probability that companies do not achieve these targets immediately from first year itself. But the idea is you are in the right orientation, and that orientation is very important for companies. There is a business aspect of decarbonization, and that lies fundamentally in how transparent you as a company are. You disclose your emissions, you share with all the stakeholders of your company on what your emissions are, what are your targets you set, and what are your short, medium, and long term plans, if I may put it that way, to your stakeholders, and publicly market it and say, like, we want to be a climate responsive company. That itself brings in more clients to your company. That's fundamentally what companies of any size should look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's a really good example that you're giving by this responsible fashion company, because what we have seen with the more than 800 companies we've worked with is that the moment when you accept sustainability as a journey, as something that is a process, you calculate, you set an agenda, you take the first steps into decarbonization, and then you also involve your stakeholders along the way, you stand a better chance of having partners in crime, so to say, that help you achieve your mission. And of course, they do it in a manner that you are a lot more effective with your time and your resources. One exciting comment here that might be a bit controversial is related to the energy prices that we have at the moment. Europe has never experienced such high energy prices, and George here is expressing his hope that decarbonization coupled with reduction of emissions packed with energy savings is essentially the way businesses will go forward into this important direction. But how do you think about energy costs, and how do you explain to someone that maybe is burdened by these costs to think about sustainability at scale and decarbonization at scale today?
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? So, as Georgie rightly pointed out, decarbonization is not always related to energy savings. That's one part of it. But the energy prices or the energy crisis that we currently see in Europe right now, and the rise in energy prices, is predominantly because of the supply chain that we see. We are not new to this. Nikolai Kondrativ is a Russian economist who never came to limelight because what he proposed was too too drastic at that moment. What he predicted is short and medium waves in economic cycles. So every time there is a new invention, the global economy increases till we reach a tipping point and then it drops down. And then there is a new invention that comes and then we reach a tipping point and then it goes down. So this is highly correlated with the energy crisis in the past as well. And I mentioned about cognitive waves because I'm coming to an example which wonderfully fits as an answer to what Georgie asked. Copenhagen, Denmark. Take Denmark as an example. During the last energy crisis, everyone was hit in Europe, and nobody did as much as Denmark did at that time. And Denmark at that time focused very heavily on fossil fuels. And what it did is, instead of gambling with the existing fossil fuel industry, it wanted to become very self-reliant and started investing very heavily in renewable energy. And what happened is what we see today. The common heat and water power plants that we see that basically they're used for heating the homes in Denmark. They are so efficient and very cheap. So there is a technology we have available at scale, and since they have already invested 2 decades ago, they are anything that they receive as an income is their savings. So that at a country scale, we see how you can be A, energy independent, and B, really start getting the gains from getting being independent with regard to your energy supply chain, so to say. So the moment I believe, Georgie, that this is a bit temporary, you see how Germany has changed its plans. Now it wants to decarbonize way before than its initial plans. And that's pretty much what happened in Denmark before. So I hope this answers your question, Georgie.
Thank you so much for this. And given we only have 5 minutes, I'm going to take one or two last questions. One question that it has come from Tomni is about voluntary decarbonization being enough or not particularly. How do you think about this? Do you feel like the fact that regulatory frameworks, as you mentioned earlier, are at the moment allowing for anyone to determine their own agenda by themselves is a good idea? Do we need governments to join in this whole discussion, or we need some sort of class action, citizen action that can push this forward?
Yeah, in principle, in generally, I am personally a huge fan of giving incentive actions than punitive actions, because when you look at a policy, it's always, in most of the cases, oriented as punitive actions. If you don't this, you will be fine. If you do this, you will be fine, right? But the framework, if we can frame, because the climate debate is very ripe, and this is the right moment we are talking about it. If we, you should not force a company to decarbonize, but you can start giving incentives. And by giving incentives, you go beyond the voluntary decarbonization, so to say. So the markets will really kick in. The CDM markets, they boomed during that time. Okay, there was another issues with the CDM credits back in the time, but the idea is you trigger innovation by giving these incentives. I believe that it should be a combination of voluntary from bottom up and top down from the government policies as well. A combination of both, but what we get from top down shouldn't be, in my opinion, punitive mechanisms, but more incentivizes, which really triggers the innovation that is currently going in this field.
I love this. I think it's such an important comment to make because it really allows us to think in the opportunity of sustainability rather than in this fear infused, powered by all the concerns and worst case scenarios that maybe many people still have in their minds. I want to ask you to share maybe some final thoughts of on the topic or on how you feel about where we're headed before we close off.
Yeah. So I started with my experience in the past, and I want to end with my outlook to the future. I think when I was doing research, I thought that the world is black and white. And after joining Plan A, I realized that there are just multiple shades of gray. And in this, since I joined Plan A in the past 1 year, I have seen clients who are extremely motivated and willing to run even the last mile in the marathon to actually become a climate responsive companies. And then on the other hand, I have seen companies who are very much struggling to get the basis right itself. So you see the whole spectrum of the market, but the common denominator in this is there is a lot of momentum that is going on. And that really puts me in a very optimistic position. I think we know that climate change is real. We know that it is human induced. We have the technologies at scale. Add changing human consumption or attitude towards consumption of goods and services, behavioral patterns, I think we are pretty much on the right track. But we have talked a lot. I think we should start taking actions today.
Thank you so much for this, Bobby. I'm sure that many people from the audience are absolutely jealous that I get to spend a lot of time with you and learn from you on a daily basis. It has been my utmost honor, as per usual. And I want to thank everyone that joined. We've had hundreds of people joining in. We are continuing with these series, and we're going to be having more than 10 more participants that are lined up already for the coming months. So stay tuned, and we wish you a wonderful Friday. Enjoy the weekend in a mindful for the planet manner.
Thank you very much, Lubomila.
Thank you, Bobby.